Hello, welcome, and thank you for coming to this talk, Make It a Pillar, Prioritizing Accessibility in the AAA Market. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Ryan Green, and I'm the lead game designer at Playground Games. Now, that's all well and good, you might say, but what does this guy know about accessibility? And if you'd asked me back in early 2019 when I just joined Playground, my answer would have been, not much. I had a vague interest in game accessibility as I'm colorblind myself, but beyond my own experiences, I was pretty much a novice. But my colleague at Turn 10 Studios, John Knowles, asked me to represent the Forza Horizon franchise as an accessibility champion. And in order to do so, that meant I would need to do a fair bit of research. I needed to become the Horizon team's resident expert on accessibility, and I looked for guidance everywhere. In Xbox Game Studios guidelines, in community sites like Can I Play That, and in other games, games that were getting praise like Gears of War 5 and Celeste, and also situations where game accessibility had gone infamously wrong. And so I came out of all of that, not quite feeling like the expert I was supposed to be, but at least having an idea of what our target was. And I took that and ultimately shaped it into a design for the accessibility features in Forza Horizon 5. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the accessibility updates we've made in Forza Horizon, and we'll also do a more in-depth look at our recent big accessibility feature, sign language support. I'll be going over some of the challenges we faced while building accessibility features and how we reacted to them. And finally, I'll be talking a little bit about what we've got planned for the future of accessibility in Forza Horizon. A bit of history first. I'm not the first person to talk about the Forza franchise at the Game Accessibility Conference. No, in fact, John Knowles, the very instigator of my own journey into the world of accessibility, that honor goes to him. He gave a talk at the Game Accessibility Conference 2019 titled Making Forza More Accessible. He talked about some of the history of the Forza franchise and its growing emphasis on becoming more accessible. He described Turn 10's experience with an inclusive design summit, which is going to be relevant to some of Playground's own experiences with that. And finally, he finished off with his own wish for the franchise. He pointed out that the subtitles in Forza Horizon 4 were not quite what we wanted in terms of accessibility. The version we had at the time was slick and stylish, but actually missed a lot of marks on actual accessibility, and John wanted to see that improve. So that was 3 years ago. What happened since then? Well, first of all, we overhauled all the subtitles in Forza Horizon 4. You can see the original version of Horizon 4's subtitles here. It's rather telling that I was tempted to zoom in on this image so that it'd be easier for everyone to see the subtitles, but I decided that would be cheating. As you can see, the subtitles are tucked away in the bottom corner. There's the speaker's name down there, but it's buried by a little speaker icon, and the text itself is rather tiny. We rightfully got some critical feedback from accessibility communities about this feature, so we changed it. The subtitles got a full visual overhaul in a live update to Forza Horizon 4. We let go of our fancy iconography and went straight for the BBC subtitle guidelines. We changed the font, placed the subtitles in the bottom center where literally everyone expects them to be, and we let players customize their text size and background. We also added a subtitle bolding option, which I'll go into a little bit more later. And these changes actually caused Can I Play That to revisit its original Horizon 4 review and graced us with their Best Post-Launch Patch Award. This in particular was tremendously gratifying to the team, as Can I Play That's original criticism of our subtitles is part of what spurred us to make those changes in the first place. And part of what inspired the team to make those sweeping changes was that Playground got the opportunity to participate in an XGS-sponsored inclusivity sprint. So these are really cool 3-day whirlwind training courses. I really can't sing their praises enough. We got a lot of time to sit down with subject matter experts, people who can relay the perspectives of communities with disability in a way that helped us understand accessibility problems in a much more nuanced way. It really energized the team and gave them some new ways to think about accessibility. Instead of just limits on what we could do with text or colors, it became a question of how can we actually enable more people to play our game. And along the way, we learned some really surprising facts about how players with disability actually play, things we couldn't have ever figured out on our own. In particular, we learned a lot of interesting things about hard of hearing communities and how they play games. Many players who are hard of hearing, particularly those who were born deaf, actually treat written English as a second language. Their sign language is their primary language. It's the sort of thing that sounds obvious after you say it out loud, but this was mind-blowing to us at the time. We had thought that the answer this whole time had been subtitles, just get them right and call it a day. But no. It turns out that while subtitles are essential for hard of hearing players, they're actually not optimal for many situations. Subtitles means you have to speed read nuanced text, often while actively playing the game, and now we've realized that someone who primarily signs is speed reading text that's in a second language for them, and yeah, you can start to see how some players would get overwhelmed by that. The concept for subtitle bolding came right out of that sprint, and we made it part of the subtitle overhaul in Forza Horizon 4. So by bolding key words, we made it easier for players to pick out the important bits of content in each VO line. But of course, we still had a question hanging over our heads. We'd made things better by improving the subtitles, but it still felt like there was a lot of room to do more. Before I jump into development of Forza Horizon 5, I do want to go over a concept we use at Playground called pillars. These are the touchstones that the Horizon team uses to guide ourselves on every project. These are the core concepts that drive what Horizon is. They've been pretty much set in stone for most of the franchise's history. One of the pillars is freedom. We want players to be in control of what they're doing. Another is beauty. We always want to make sure that players are invited into worlds that are a treat to behold. And we've got Horizon Fun. It's a game after all. I mean, what are we even doing if we're not having fun? And like I said, these have been solid. These have been our foundation for a while now. But we were building the plan for Forza Horizon 5, and we decided that we actually needed something more, something that represented what Horizon was becoming as we moved towards being an online space for players to meet and play together. We added a new pillar, community. And of course, we had to define what community meant to us and broke that down into 3 parts. Players had to feel welcome, and that feeling had to extend to all players, meaning it had to be inclusive and, of course, accessible. So what does that mean? It means that now accessibility has top billing. When we're not sure what direction to go with a feature, we use the pillars to know our goals. And at this moment, we had inscribed accessibility into the core of what we were trying to do with our games. And this was huge for us. In that early blueprint of what would eventually become Forza Horizon 5, we had a feature planned out. We called it the Holistic Accessibility Approach, mainly because I absolutely cannot resist giving things fancy names. So what is holistic accessibility? Well, really, it's an obscure way of saying that we weren't going to drive all of our accessibility efforts into some fancy, glamorous-looking feature that would cost more than it needed to and probably wouldn't end up being all that accessible. We had been down that road before, and we knew a bit better this time. So instead, we went for the obvious. Find out where others have done something well and join them in doing that. find out what players expect and what they're asking for, and just do that. Fill in as many accessibility gaps as we possibly could. And this led to a plan with a much wider set of options, customizations, texts that can be resized beyond just subtitles, screen reader support, improvements to our auto steer. Our main big ticket item at the time was inspired from Celeste. Why not let players control the speed of the game itself? In fact, we had already given ourselves the ability to do this through our debug controls, and it's part of how we make those cool cinematic slow-mo moments. So we just took that ability and put it in the hands of players. So now if the game is moving a bit too fast for a player to keep up with, they can tune it to their liking. And overall, Playground liked this plan. It made a lot of sense to look at accessibility from a sort of utilitarian, how can we close the gaps kind of way. It just felt like we weren't pushing ourselves as hard as we could. We were happy to borrow best practices from elsewhere. Don't reinvent the wheel, right? But still, maybe there was something unexplored there, something we could do to not just keep up with the industry on accessibility, but to help push it forward. And so we decided, you know what? Let's go for it. Let's keep everything we said we'd do because we think they're good to just do. But we need to push the envelope a little bit. Let's try and put sign language into the game. And of course, that just opens the door to a whole load of new questions. Which sign languages are we supporting and how many? We weren't sure exactly how we were going to do this yet, so we wanted to start small, but we also wanted to make sure that we built ourselves room to grow. We decided to support 2 languages, American Sign Language and British Sign Language, meaning we'd need to build a system that could choose which sign language to use. And that meant that we would have an opening in the future to add more languages as the opportunity arose. But how are you going to get these into the game in the first place? I mean, that's the real doozy. Animations are time and resource intensive, and the sheer complexity of animating sign language alone in a way that players could easily understand is rather intimidating. We looked for references in other games, but unfortunately didn't turn up much. Spider-Man Miles Morales has a cool mission where the NPC will sign to you. And we also ran into Moss, which is a VR game that features a mouse that signs to you. It's some really neat stuff, but nothing that was explicitly, this is sign language so players can understand what's being said. Nothing that formal. Instead, we found references in the real world from televised speeches and rock concerts, which feature live signed interpretation. And so we landed on the only way that seemed to fit into the project in any kind of practical way. We'll film someone signing and put that video into the game directly. Again, we found the best way was to build on ideas that had already been shown to work, even when there weren't any easy examples to lean on in the game space. So now that we've sorted that, we still have to figure out who we're putting in front of the camera. We could use an interpreter, as you'll often see in major speeches or other important events. Sign language interpreters are very accurate in reflecting exactly what is being said, but there's a lot of tonal information that's lost in that. Alternatively, we could hire deaf acting talent instead, and that's much better for on-screen presence and getting the vibe just right. But what about the translations? This feature is meant to make the game more accessible to players who sign, so we need to be sure that we're adding to the game a genuinely accurate translation. So we decided to just get the best of both worlds. We wanted the signers for both languages to seem like they were part of the Horizon Festival, like they were just a natural part of the game, and we knew we'd need to hire professional actors in order to get that feel. But we also knew that we needed to have clear, accurate signing in order to get players to have any benefit from the feature. We ended up pairing the actor for both languages with a certified interpreter of that language, supporting them directly during filming. helping adjust the actor's signing whenever needed. Even with these major questions sorted, we still had quite a few hurdles to deal with during development. Firstly, while picture-in-picture wasn't overly complicated to set up, it did have a hefty memory cost, hefty enough that it just couldn't really function during high-speed gameplay. However, we did find space for this during our cutscenes and cinematics, which is where a lot of the exposition and emotive language happens in our game. We also ran into some problems with the sheer size of the videos. So dimensions for these videos are small, and each individual file isn't egregiously large. But there are a lot of scenes in the game, and each video file starts to stack up. We're also going to be adding to these constantly. As new content gets added to the live game, new sign language videos will come along with them. And one option we're still considering is to separate these sign languages into optionally downloadable packs. We're not at that point yet, but for instance, if we add more languages, we'll need to address the size problem again. Another issue we ran into is that sign language is less editable than standard audio voiceover. With standard VO, you can clip or edit lines, tweaking things to make the timing of the delivery fit just right, but you can't really do that with sign language. You can't just cut a sentence out of the middle of a signed scene because you'd have the signer just blipping from one stance to another. It's not a good experience. But this means that initial filming of the sign language translation needs to happen after all voiceover work is completely final. Otherwise, any edit to a scene would trigger the need to completely refilm the signing. And finally, we realized that we were going to need some help getting proper feedback on this feature. XGS has been super helpful in this, and they've been helping us get in touch with communities of hard of hearing gamers. The big hurdle here, though, is how are we going to gather that feedback? We're trying to support players who see written English as their second language, so we needed to make sure that we gave those players a way to sign their feedback to us. Relying on purely written channels would essentially create a barrier for the very players we wanted feedback from the most. We're currently working with an organization to receive signed video feedback and attach English subtitles to the video, allowing us to directly receive feedback from players who use sign language. So let's say you're looking to put sign language in your game. What are the big ticket things that you should know beforehand? Well, first off, be ready to step into a massive network of communities. It can be genuinely overwhelming for outsiders. Sign languages are like spoken languages. There are styles, dialects, slang, all of which can complicate translation plans. One thing to bear in mind is that sign language can be surprisingly mobile, especially when an actor is voicing two characters in conversation. As you can see, the signer's orientation and body placement are used to indicate which character is talking, but from a technical angle, it means we needed to have strong guidelines in place for how far the actor should move from their center point. Otherwise, they risk stepping off screen. You'll also want to make sure you clearly label every piece of sign language content, because the only people who can verify videos are necessarily fluent in sign language. Everyone else has to go by the label. But wait, there's more. Context will always help with VO performances, but signing even more so. In order to properly capture a scene's dialogue, a signer will need not just the written line, but also tonal information, inflection, timing, and so on. The best case is to give the signer a final cut of the scene they're going to be translating. We also ran into some complications with mixed languages. In Horizon 5, this would occur when a character would mix Spanish and English words in the same line. If you have this sort of VO line and you're doing sign language, you'll want to have a strategy in place beforehand. Otherwise, the signer can get confused by what they're reading. Sign language also has its own set of tropes that will help clarify messaging, and it's good to follow these. They're not explicitly words or phrases, but just things that are expected as part of the rhythm of this. For instance, starting and ending every line in the rest position is a way to indicate to players that they should or shouldn't be watching the signer's movements at any given time. It's also important to align the timings of each signed line with the actual spoken VO. This is because players often will mix audio, subtitles, and sign language together, so if these aren't in sync, it can create a very jarring experience. And finally, this one feels obvious, but it's worth saying, no visual clutter. Players need to be able to see the signer's hands and face above all else, so don't go adding any fancy special effects or patterned backgrounds. Keep things simple. So we've done a lot, and we've put a lot of thought and effort into our accessibility feature set, but really there's only one question to ask at the end of the day. How did we do? Well, I'm happy to say that Forza Horizon 5 is a major step forward for us. The overall accessibility feedback for Horizon 5 has been very positive, and we were honored with Can I Play That's AAA Excellence Award, and the Game Awards recognized us for innovation and accessibility, all of which is a shiny way of saying that our simplified fill-the-gaps approach seems to really fit the bill. Personally, I point to our improvements to automatic steering in Horizon 5 as being the biggest impact in terms of our accessibility. If we define accessibility literally and ask ourselves how many players can access the content in our game, then I think the biggest increase in that pool of players comes from our changes to auto steer. Another perhaps more quiet win on the accessibility front was in our Horizon stories. These are chapter-by-chapter narratives that could be a potential roadblock for some players. So we made sure that even if players couldn't overcome a driving challenge, they'd be able to proceed with the story. Again, just taking accessibility literally. If we can grant access to players who wouldn't otherwise have it, then we should. That's not to say that all feedback was positive. We received some criticism for our world map requiring players to move a floating cursor through 2D space. This can be difficult for players with input restrictions and isn't very blind accessible. We also received some feedback about visual effects that can't be turned off by players, but some players find motion blur and bloom, for instance, distracting, so not being able to toggle them off became an accessibility problem. And finally, while AutoSteer did grant access to many players, it did so at the cost of kind of controlling what they did in moment-to-moment gameplay, which isn't ideal. As for sign language, how did we fare on that? Well, it's actually a little bit early to tell. We released sign language support for both ASL and BSL in our Series 5 live update. We had hoped to include them with the game at launch, but as I've described, the realities of filmed sign language make that nigh impossible. Releasing sign language support in an early live patch made more practical sense and gave us some time to develop customization options to coincide with the feature's launch. Players are able to modify the background of their signed videos and can choose where on the screen the video will appear. We're also working on the ability for players to resize these videos. Like subtitles, the best way to make a feature readable is just to let a player tweak it themselves. We've also begun our efforts in gathering feedback from hard-of-hearing communities on these features. We're still gathering feedback, and I don't want to be counting unhatched chickens, but I can say we've at least gotten enough positive feedback to know that this was worth doing. So that's the story of our accessibility journey through the development of Horizon 5. But what happens next? What now? Well, firstly, we're working with Turn 10 to make sure that accessibility features are shared across the Forza franchise. These efforts have already borne some fruit, actually, as Horizon's AutoSteer was built from tech originally developed by the Motorsport team. We're also working with the larger XGS org to share our learnings on sign language, with the hope that it will inspire more studios to support sign languages in games. As I said before, I'm personally crusading for interface improvements for our world map with the goal of supporting single-button navigation. This would theoretically make all of Horizon 5 accessible to blind players and represents the biggest gap in the game's overall accessibility. We're also looking at hold-free pedal control options, and I'm eager to see what comes from that. And finally, please bear with me. I'm going to be a bit selfish and steal this last moment to rant about accessibility in general. The biggest thing I've learned about accessibility is that in the end, it all comes down to the numbers. There are some great feel-good moments when you're doing accessibility work, especially when you manage to grant someone an experience that they couldn't have had before. But when you're choosing what to prioritize and what features to pursue, it all comes down to access. Who has it and who doesn't? A feature doesn't need to be flashy, fancy, or slick to do its job. It just needs to grant players that access. Empathy. It's huge in accessibility. It helps us understand the different experiences that players can have. But it's also important not to let that fool you into thinking that you know the right answer. You have to be constantly checking in with communities, making sure that the features you're building are actually helping your target audience. PG was confident that subtitles were the answer for hard of hearing folk, right up until we had a subject matter expert, someone who lives this experience and who works with signing communities, give us a wake-up call. Don't bite off more than you can chew. In looking over the state of accessibility in games, you will find countless examples where poorly thought out accessibility features either didn't help their intended targets or died of starvation on the production room floor. If you want to avoid this, start small. Try to find simple or player-controlled solutions to problems. Flashy solutions are best saved for when the basics have already been mostly covered. And the last most important thing for accessibility in games, never stop listening. Accessibility is an extension of usability. It's user-friendliness, meaning you need to constantly be asking your players, how can this be better? Sometimes you already know the answer and you can just carry on with your plans, but more often than not, some of that feedback will surprise the heck out of you, will warrant some real consideration. And that's the conclusion of my talk. Thank you all for listening. I hope that you found parts of this valuable or at least interesting. So long. Bye.